The pregnant woman with twins was left alone. The millionaire she met made an offer that. The eviction notice fluttered in Phoenix Taylor's hands as she stared at the positive pregnancy test on the bathroom sink. Two bright pink lines. Twins, according to the ultrasound carried out that morning. The irony of fate couldn't have been crueler in her Boston apartment. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises. The words of the official document seemed to mock her. Phoenix ran a hand through her red hair and took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. At 28, she had never imagined finding herself in this situation. Pregnant, alone, and about to lose her home. Her cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. It was her boss, Miranda Bennett from the law firm where she worked as a paralegal. "Phoenix, I need you to organize an urgent meeting with the CEO of Drake Industries for tomorrow. It's about the merger, Caspian Drake." The billionaire's name was whispered in Boston's corridors of power with a mixture of admiration and awe. At 35, he had turned the family business into a technology empire, but his reputation as a cold and calculating man preceded him. Phoenix confirmed the meeting and looked around the small room. This simple but lovingly chosen furniture would soon have to be put into storage or sold. His savings would barely cover a month's rent anywhere decent in the city, let alone the costs of a twin pregnancy. The next morning, the Drake Industries office occupied the top floors of a mirrored skyscraper in the financial center. Phoenix was waiting in the president's office, organizing the documents for the meeting, when the door opened abruptly. "Miss Taylor." Caspian Drake's deep voice surprised her. Tall, with broad shoulders under an impeccable Italian suit, his blue-gray eyes studied her with intensity. "Come in, please." The meeting was going normally until a wave of nausea hit Phoenix. She tried to disguise it, but the world spun and her legs were weak. Caspian caught her before she fell, his strong arms supporting her. "Are you all right?" The concern in his voice sounded genuine, unlike his usual coldness. It's the twins," Phoenix murmured before she could stop herself. Caspian's eyes widened slightly. "Sit down," he commanded, guiding her to a leather sofa. "How long has it been?" 12 weeks, she replied, regaining her composure. "Sorry, Mr. Drake, this won't interfere with my work." Something changed in his expression. "Where's Dad?" "He's not on the set," Phoenix replied dryly, thinking of Marcus, who had disappeared at the first sign of complication. Caspian watched her for a few moments, as if making a crucial decision. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Taylor." What followed seemed surreal. Caspian explained that his traditional family was pressuring him into a marriage, threatening his control over the company. He needed a bride to appease them, someone discreet and intelligent. An agreement to the convenience, he specified. "You'll get a place to live, financial support for your children, and in return, you'll pretend to be my fiancé for 6 months." Phoenix felt his heart race. The proposal was absurd, but when she thought of her babies, "Why me?" "Because you're the only person in this building who looks me in the eye without fear or greed," he replied with surprising honesty. "And because I need someone who understands that this is just business." That night, alone in her almost empty apartment, Phoenix weighed up her options. The walls seemed to close in on her, reminding her of the eviction deadline. Her babies deserved more than a homeless mother. Her phone rang again. It was Caspian. "Have you thought about my proposal?" Phoenix closed her eyes, one hand resting on her still flat belly. "Yes," she replied, her voice firm despite the trembling in her hands. "I accept." "Good. My driver will be here in an hour to take you to the Drake mansion. Just bring the essentials. We'll buy the rest tomorrow." When she hung up, Phoenix looked around the apartment she had called home for the last 3 years. In a few hours, his life would change completely. A deal of convenience with one of the most powerful men in Boston. What could possibly go wrong? As she packed her clothes into a suitcase, Phoenix couldn't shake the feeling that she was diving into much deeper waters than she had imagined. Caspian Drake's penetrating gaze still burned in her memory, and something inside her told her that this deal would change much more than just her financial situation. The next 6 months promised more surprises than either of them could have anticipated. Between the walls of the Drake mansion, hearts frozen by time and mistrust would learn that sometimes fate has very different plans from our own. And maybe, just maybe, an agreement of convenience could turn into something much truer. The Drake mansion stood imposingly against the Boston night sky, its illuminated windows reflecting like crystals in the waters of the infinity pool. Phoenix held her only suitcase tightly as the chauffeur opened the door of the black Bentley. The reality of her situation hit her like an icy wave. She was about to enter the home of a man she barely knew, carrying a made-up story and two very real babies in her womb. Miss Taylor. Caspian's deep voice welcomed her into the entrance hall, marble and crystal everywhere. He had swapped his office suit for a casual long-sleeved shirt, but his posture remained regal. "Welcome to your new home." "Temporary," Phoenix corrected gently, reminding herself of the terms of the agreement. 6 months. It was only a contract. Caspian arched an eyebrow, an almost imperceptible half-smile on his lips. "Of course. Let me show you to your quarters." As they walked up the curving staircase, Phoenix noticed the details of the decoration, contemporary works of art mixed with old family pieces, creating an intriguing contrast between modernity and tradition. Like Caspian himself, "Your suite is in this wing," he explained, leading her down a corridor. "I've also had the adjoining room prepared for the nursery." Phoenix stopped abruptly. "Have you ever planned a nursery?" "Efficiency is my trademark," Caspian replied, opening the door to the suite. "Besides, we need to be convincing. My family expects a newly engaged couple to be prepared for their future." The room was larger than his old apartment in its entirety. A king-size bed dominated the space, cream silk curtains descended from the high ceiling, and a private balcony overlooked the impeccable gardens. "The closet is already equipped with a few basic pieces," Caspian continued professionally. "Tomorrow, my personal shopper will help you choose an appropriate closet for your new role." "That seems excessive," Phoenix protested, thinking of his zeros in his bank account. "It's necessary," he cut in. "A fiancé of mine needs to dress appropriately. I've also made an appointment with Dr. Bennett, the best obstetrician in town." Phoenix felt a pang of gratitude mixed with discomfort. "Mr. Drake Caspian," he corrected. "If we're going to make this work, we need to treat each other with intimacy." Their eyes met, and for a moment Phoenix glimpsed something beyond the mask of coldness. A vulnerability, perhaps, but it passed too quickly to be sure. "There are rules," Caspian continued, walking out onto the balcony. 1. In public, we're a couple in love. 2. My family can't suspect anything. 3. Absolute discretion about the arrangement. Phoenix followed him, the night air stirring her red hair. "What about the twins?" "We'll say that we'd already been together for a few months, keeping it a secret because of the media. The pregnancy hastened the engagement." He turned to face her, convincing and close enough to the truth. "Except for the romance part," Phoenix muttered. Something darkened in Caspian's gaze. "Love is overrated in business, Miss Taylor. I learned that early." Before Phoenix could reply, a knock on the door announced the arrival of the housekeeper, Mrs. Chone, a kindly Asian lady carrying a tray of tea and cookies. "I thought you might be hungry," she smiled maternally. "Pregnant women need to eat well." Phoenix then realized that she hadn't eaten since breakfast, nausea and anxiety having dominated her day. Her stomach rumbled in approval. "Mrs. Chun will take care of your needs," Caspian informed her. "She's the only employee who knows the truth about our arrangement. I've trusted her for years." The housekeeper nodded discreetly and withdrew, leaving them alone again. Phoenix poured herself some tea, trying to process the dramatic change in her life over the last few hours. "Tomorrow evening," Caspian said, checking his wristwatch, "there will be a family dinner. It will be our first official appearance as a couple." Phoenix almost choked on her cookie. "So soon? The sooner we establish history, the better." He walked to the door, pausing only to add, "Sleep well, Phoenix. Tomorrow your training as a Drake bride begins." Alone in the luxurious suite, Phoenix let herself sink into the soft bed. Her hands found her womb, where her babies were growing oblivious to the complexity of the situation. "It's going to be okay," she whispered more to herself than to them. "Mommy will make sure of it." But as the night wore on and sleep didn't come, Phoenix couldn't stop thinking about the enigmatic man downstairs. Caspian Drake, with his piercing eyes and calculated words, was a mystery she would need to unravel over the coming months. What frightened her more? The prospect of deceiving an entire family, with a growing feeling that there was something more behind her fake fiancé's icy facade. The answer she suspected would change everything. The sound of Phoenix's heels echoed through the corridors of the Drake mansion as she followed Mrs. Chon into the master closet. After an intense morning with the personal shopper, who had made her try on more clothes than in her entire life, she was now preparing for the dreaded family dinner. The Drake family is traditional, Mrs. Chon explained as she adjusted the navy blue dress Phoenix had chosen. But don't be intimidated, especially by the matriarch, Victoria Drake. Phoenix looked at her reflection in the full-length mirror. The midi dress hugged her curves subtly, not yet revealing her pregnancy. Her red hair was elegantly tied up in a low bun, and the soft makeup highlighted her green eyes. "Do I really look like a billionaire bride?" she asked, unsure. "You look like yourself," a deep voice replied from the doorway. Caspian was leaning against the door frame, his eyes scanning her figure with an intensity that made Phoenix blush. "And that's exactly what we need." Mrs. Chen discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone. Caspian approached, holding a small velvet box. "Every engagement needs a ring," he said, opening the box to reveal a dazzling diamond solitaire. "It belonged to my grandmother." "Caspian, I can't," Phoenix began, but he was already sliding the ring onto his finger. "You can and you must. My family knows this piece," he explained, his fingers lingering on her hand. "It would be strange if I didn't give it to my fiancé." The ring weighed more than its material value. It carried stories, expectations, traditions. Phoenix felt the weight of the force they were about to stage. "We need to align our history," Caspian continued, guiding her to the balcony. "We met 6 months ago during a business meeting. We kept a low profile because of the media and the company's position, and we fell madly in love," Phoenix added with a hint of irony. A muscle twitched in Caspian's jaw. "Exactly. The pregnancy was a welcome surprise that only accelerated plans we already had. Will your family believe that the most controlled man in Boston had a secret affair?" "They'll believe what they see tonight," he replied, his intense gaze fixed on her. "That's why we need to be convincing." The sound of tires in the driveway indicated the arrival of the first guests. Phoenix felt her stomach turn, and not just because of her pregnancy. "Breathe," Caspian murmured, surprising her by entwining his fingers in hers. "Follow my lead and be yourself. That's what attracted me to you, remember?" The irony didn't escape Phoenix. He was playing his part even when they were alone. The next few moments were a whirlwind of introductions. Victoria Drake, an elegant woman in her 60s, examined Phoenix with eyes sharpened by decades of social life. Alexander Drake, Caspian's father, had the same imposing bearing as his son, but with a warmer smile. "So this is the woman who finally captured our Caspian," Victoria commented over cocktails, her voice distilling a mixture of charm and skepticism. "Actually, he's the one who captured me," Phoenix replied with a soft smile, feeling Caspian's hands squeeze her waist protectively. "What about the babies?" Alexander asked, his eyes shining. "Do you know the sex yet?" "Not yet," Caspian replied, his voice carrying an emotion that surprised Phoenix. "But we've already started preparing the nursery." The evening progressed like a choreographed dance. Phoenix found herself answering questions about her family, deceased parents, raised by her grandmother in Maine, her career, legal assistant with ambitions to go to law school, and how Caspian won her over with persistence and small gestures. Over dinner, sitting next to Caspian at the long mahogany table, Phoenix realized how easy it was to get lost in fantasy. The way he leaned over to whisper comments in her ear, how his hand occasionally found hers under the table, how his eyes searched hers before answering questions about their future together. "Tell us about the proposal," Caspian's younger sister Amelia asked with dreamy eyes. Phoenix froze momentarily, but Caspian intervened gently. "It was during a private dinner in my penthouse apartment. Phoenix had just told me about the twins, and I realized that I didn't want to wait another day to make her my wife." The story was so perfectly romantic that for a moment even Phoenix almost believed it. She met Caspian's eyes and saw something indefinable in them. Vulnerability, perhaps, or just another layer of his impeccable acting. Later, as the guests began to say goodbye, Victoria pulled Phoenix into a discreet corner. "My son has always been extraordinarily focused on his goals," she said, studying Phoenix intently. "I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Phoenix felt her heart race. "Sometimes love takes you by surprise." Victoria smiled enigmatically. "Yes, dear. And sometimes it's right in front of our eyes, even when we try to deny it." When they were finally alone, Phoenix kicked off her heels with a sigh of relief. Caspian poured himself a drink at the bar in the living room. "You were impressive," he commented, offering her a glass of lemon water. "My family is completely convinced. We're a good team," Phoenix replied, trying to ignore how her body still tingled in the places where he had touched her during the night. "Yes, we are," Caspian murmured, his eyes fixed on the ring on her finger. For a moment, the silence between them carried something heavy, unspoken. "Good evening, Caspian," Phoenix finally said, turning to go up the stairs. "Phoenix," he called out when she was already on the first step. "You really were yourself today, and it was perfect." She just nodded, unable to trust her voice at that moment. In her bedroom, as she removed her makeup and the carefully constructed layers of that night, Phoenix wondered who was really wearing masks, her, Caspian, or both. The diamond ring sparkled in the lamplight, a constant reminder of the role she had agreed to play. But as she stroked her belly, feeling the twins' first flutter of movement, Phoenix wondered if it was possible to keep your heart protected when you were living such a convincing lie. The first appointment with Dr. Bennett was scheduled for that morning, and Phoenix hadn't expected Caspian to insist on accompanying her. Yet there he was, impeccable in his gray suit, sitting next to her in the modern obstetrics clinic on Beacon Hill. "The Drakes always accompany their wives to prenatal appointments," he explained quietly when he noticed her questioning look. "It would be suspicious if I didn't come." Phoenix nodded, trying to ignore how her heart raced when he unconsciously placed his hand on hers. After 3 days living in the Drake mansion, she was beginning to realize that the line between reality and acting was getting thinner with every shared moment. "Phoenix Taylor," the nurse called out, leading them into a room equipped with state-of-the-art ultrasound machines. Dr. Bennett, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, welcomed them with a warm smile. "Ah, the Drake couple. Victoria called me yesterday, extremely excited about the twins." Phoenix felt Caspian tense, slightly beside him. News really did travel fast in Boston's social circles. "Shall we take a look at these little ones?" The doctor applied the gel to his belly as he explained the procedures. "At the 12th week, we can already see a lot of detail." The sound of heartbeats filled the room. 2 distinct rhythms, strong and fast. Phoenix felt tears forming in her eyes, and when she looked at Caspian, she was surprised by the raw emotion on his usually impassive face. "There they are," Dr. Bennett pointed at the screen. "Baby A and Baby B, perfectly developed for their gestational age." Caspian leaned forward, his hands squeezing Phoenix's tighter. "They're perfect," he whispered, and for a moment, Phoenix saw beyond the mask of the calculating businessman. After the consultation, as they walked through the Boston Public Garden, a contemplative silence hung between them. Autumn painted the trees in shades of gold and red, and couples strolled hand in hand along the winding paths. "You didn't have to feign so much emotion at the clinic," Phoenix commented softly. "There was no one watching us." Caspian stopped walking, turning to face her. "Who said I was faking it?" Before Phoenix could process this revelation, her phone vibrated. It was a message from Miranda, her boss, asking her to meet her urgently at the office. "Go," Caspian said, noticing her hesitation. "The driver is waiting. I have some meetings, but I'll see you for dinner." At the office, Miranda greeted her with a worried expression. "Phoenix, we need to talk about your situation." "Miranda, I can explain." "You don't have to," her boss interrupted gently. "But I need you to understand. Your engagement to Caspian Drake is in the gossip pages. As an employee of the law firm that represents Drake Industries, this creates a potential conflict of interest." Phoenix felt his blood run cold. She hadn't considered the professional implications of her agreement with Caspian. "Am I being fired?" "No, Miranda smiled. But we'll need to transfer you to another department, away from the Drake cases. And," she hesitated, "we need to discuss your maternity leave." When Phoenix returned to the mansion that evening, he found Caspian in the study, immersed in papers. He looked up as soon as she entered, frowning as he noticed her troubled expression. "What happened? I had to change departments at work," she explained, sinking into an armchair. "Because of our arrangement." Caspian stood up, pouring 2 glasses. Wine for him, cranberry juice for her. "It bothers you. It's more a reminder of how this situation is changing every aspect of my life," Phoenix admitted, accepting the drink. "Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice. Do you have any doubts about our ability to keep up the charade?" "It's not that," she replied, meeting his eyes. "It's about how it's getting harder and harder to distinguish what's real from what's an act." A heavy silence filled the office. Caspian walked over to the window, watching the lights of Boston in the distance. "Perhaps this is the most dangerous part of our deal." "Which part?" "The fine line between truth and lies," he replied, his voice softer than usual. "Between what we do to convince others and what we start to really feel." Phoenix felt his heart race. Before he could reply, Mrs. Chin appeared to announce that dinner was served. During the meal, they talked about safe subjects, the doctor's appointment, work plans for the nursery. But something had changed. Every look seemed to carry more weight, every silence more meaning. Later, alone in her room, Phoenix removed her engagement ring, studying how the light played on the diamond's facets. In just a few days, her life had turned into an elaborate theater where she no longer knew which role she was really playing. And the most frightening thing was to realize that perhaps not even Caspian knew where the acting ended and the reality began. The news of Caspian Drake's engagement to his pregnant assistant exploded on social media exactly 1 week after the family dinner. Phoenix stared in amazement at the sensational headlines on her tablet as she ate breakfast in the mansion's spacious kitchen. Boston Insider: Billionaire Drake finds love and instant family. Drake empire to have twin heirs. Who is the mysterious bride? From assistant to future Mrs. Drake. A modern fairy tale. Ignore it, Caspian said, entering the kitchen still adjusting his tie. Our PR department is controlling the narrative. Phoenix pushed the tablet away. There are photos of us in a public garden. Someone followed us after the doctor's appointment. It was expected, he replied, sitting down next to her with a cup of black coffee. His knee brushed lightly against hers, a touch that sent shivers down her spine. The important thing is that the story is being told the way we planned. Mrs. Chin entered quietly, placing more toast and fresh fruit on the table. Her motherly gaze rested on Phoenix for a moment before discreetly withdrawing. "Your mother called," Phoenix commented, trying to ignore how Caspian's proximity affected her senses. "She wants to take us to lunch at Hampshire House today." "Victoria wastes no time," Caspian sighed. "She probably wants to discuss the wedding plans." The word wedding hung between them like a heavy cloud. In theory, their agreement would end before they got that far. But the mention made Phoenix's stomach squirm in a way that had nothing to do with pregnancy. Should we refuse? No, it would be suspicious. Caspian checked his watch. "I have a video conference with investors in Tokyo right now, but I can meet you there at noon." As he stood up, his hand lightly brushed Phoenix's shoulder. The seemingly casual gesture made her heart leap. These little moments of unstaged intimacy were becoming more frequent and more disturbing. Victoria Drake was the embodiment of elegance when Phoenix arrived at the Hampshire House, one of Boston's most exclusive restaurants. The historic establishment, with its mahogany paneling and view of the public garden, exuded old wealth and tradition. "Darling," Victoria greeted her with kisses in the air. "You look radiant. Pregnancy definitely suits you." Phoenix smiled, adjusting the emerald green dress she had chosen that morning, one of many new pieces in her closet. "Thank you, Victoria. The nausea is finally subsiding." "Excellent. Now we can concentrate on what really matters, your wedding." Victoria opened an elegant folder, revealing sample invitations, color palettes, and photographs of venues for the ceremony. Phoenix felt panic rise in her chest. "Actually," she began, "Caspian and I were thinking of something more intimate." "Nonsense," Victoria dismissed the idea with a gesture. "A Drake doesn't get married discreetly. I've already booked the Boston Public Library for December. It's the perfect time before your pregnancy becomes too apparent in the photos. Phoenix choked on her ginger tea. December? But that's in 3 months, Caspian added, materializing at the side of the table. He leaned over to kiss Phoenix's cheek, his lips lingering a second longer than necessary. Hello, darling. Maon, Victorious Maid Trayamfendity. Caspian, I was showing Phoenix some imitation templates. The gold embossed typography would look divine with the winter theme I've imagined. Phoenix watched Caspian sit down next to her, his thigh pressed against hers under the table. He entwined his fingers in hers, a gesture that should have been just for show, but anchored her somehow. Mom, he said softly, Phoenix and I would appreciate taking a more active part in planning our own wedding. Victoria stop perfectly the old naivedo. Honey, you already have enough to worry about. The pregnancy, the merger with West Tech, the penthouse renovation in Back Bay. Leave the details to me. Lunch proceeded as a gentle battle of wills, with Victoria coming up with grandiose plans and Caspian diplomatically trying to contain them. Phoenix remained largely silent, her mind spinning with the reality that their 6-month agreement was fast turning into something much bigger. When they finally left the restaurant, the fall afternoon was surprisingly warm. Caspian suggested a walk through the public garden, ignoring the curious stares of passers-by who clearly recognized them from the pictures in the tabloids. I'm sorry about that, he said when they were out of earshot. My mother can be intense. December, Caspian, Phoenix whispered. How are we going to explain it when the agreement ends before the wedding? He stopped walking, turning to face her. His blue-gray eyes were stormy. What if we don't? The world seemed to freeze for a moment. What do you mean? I'm suggesting, he ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of nervousness, that perhaps we could extend the agreement. For the sake of the babies, the company. For how long? Phoenix asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. As long as it takes, he replied, his voice low and intense. Things are working well, aren't they? We understand each other. Phoenix felt the weight of the diamond ring on her finger, the expectations of an entire family, the future of her children, and underneath it all, something else, something unplanned that was growing between her and Caspian with each passing day. Yes, she finally replied, we understand each other. But as they walked back to the car, Phoenix wondered if they really understood each other or if they were just diving deeper into an illusion that would eventually consume them completely. Autumn in Boston was painting the windows of the Drake mansion with golden shadows when Phoenix found the first letter. She was organizing some boxes in Caspian's office at his request when a yellowed envelope slipped out of an old business law book. The delicate handwriting addressed the message to "My dear Cass" and was dated 5 years ago. Phoenix knew he shouldn't read it, but something about the way the paper was crumpled and creased, as if it had been read countless times, captured his attention. Cass, I know that by the time this letter reaches you, I'll have left for London. I can't go on with this marriage knowing that your heart belongs more to Drake Industries than to me. You are an extraordinary man, but your fear of loving completely is destroying any chance of real happiness. Yours affectionately, Claire. Find anything interesting? Phoenix almost dropped the letter with shock. Caspian was standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry, she began. I shouldn't have. Claire Harrison, he interrupted, crossing the room to pick up the letter. My ex-fiancée. I imagine you heard the rumors in the office. Phoenix nodded. Caspian sat down heavily in his leather armchair, the last rays of the sun highlighting the lines of tension on his face. She was perfect on paper. Traditional family, impeccable education, right connections. But you didn't love her, Phoenix added softly. I didn't know how, he admitted, surprising her with his honesty. My father taught me from an early age that feelings are a weakness in business. I've applied that logic to every aspect of my life. Phoenix unconsciously stroked his belly, where the twins moved gently. Is that why you chose an agreement of convenience with me? Because it's safer than real love? The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Caspian stood up, walking over to the window. When I saw you that first day, pregnant and vulnerable, but still strong, something changed, he confessed, his voice low. For the first time, I wanted to protect someone without calculating the benefits. Phoenix's heart raced. Before he could reply, Mrs. Chan appeared at the door. "Mr. Drake, your sister Amelia is here. She says it's urgent." "We don't have to go if you don't want to," she offered. "I can tell you that I'm not feeling well." "No," he replied, surprising her. "I think it would do us good. Away from the eyes of Boston, the expectations." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "Maybe we can find out where we really are in this story we've created." That night, lying in her bed, Phoenix reflected on the layers of complexity that her agreement with Caspian had taken on. Claire's letter echoed in her mind, a man afraid to love completely. But over the last few weeks, she had glimpsed moments of vulnerability behind Caspian's controlled facade. Her babies moved, as if sensing her unease. "What do you think?" she whispered, stroking the belly that was starting to become more visible. "Are we getting dangerously close to something real?" The silence of the night offered no answers, only the soft rustle of autumn leaves dancing against her window. Somewhere in the mansion, Phoenix could hear Caspian still working in his office, as if the constant movement of business could keep more disturbing thoughts at bay. Newport promised to be more than just a weekend at the Drake family beach house. It would be a test of their limits, of their ability to keep up the charade, and perhaps most frighteningly, of their growing emotions for each other. The Drake Summer Mansion in Newport was an imposing Victorian building overlooking the Atlantic, its bay windows reflecting the morning sun as Caspian's Bentley drove up the gravel driveway. Phoenix couldn't hold back a sigh of admiration. The place seemed straight out of a period novel. "My grandmother loved this place," Caspian commented, parking the car. "We spent every summer here as children." It was the first time Phoenix had heard him talk about his childhood with such a nostalgic tone. As they climbed the porch steps, she noticed how his shoulders, always tense, seemed to relax. Mrs. Churn, who had arrived earlier to prepare the house, welcomed them with hot tea and homemade gingerbread cookies. "The rooms are ready. I've prepared the master suite for you." Phoenix and Caspian exchanged a quick glance. Until then, at the mansion in Boston, they had slept in separate rooms. The forced intimacy of this weekend in Newport added a new layer of complexity to their arrangement. "I'll show you around," Caspian offered after they had settled in. As they walked through the manicured gardens, he pointed out places marked by memories. "That's where Amelia broke her arm trying to climb that tree. And in that gazebo, my grandmother used to read to us on summer afternoons." "You were close to her," Phoenix observed, noticing how her eyes softened when she spoke of her grandmother. "Eleanor Drake was different from the rest of the family," he admitted, leading her down a path that led to the private beach. She believed that true success came from the heart, not just from numbers in a bank account. The sea wind ruffled Phoenix's hair, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself. Caspian, noticing her trembling, instinctively pulled her closer to his body. "She would have loved you," he murmured, so low that Phoenix almost lost her words among the roar of the waves. "Why? Because you're real," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. "Even in this artificial situation we've created, you've never lost your authenticity." The moment was interrupted by the ringing of Caspian's cell phone, a video call from Victoria Drake. "Darlings," her voice echoed excitedly. "How's the house? I thought I'd join you tomorrow to discuss the floral arrangements for the wedding." Phoenix felt Caspian tense beside her. "Mom, we came here to rest. The doctors recommended that Phoenix avoid stress." "Oh, but wedding planning isn't stress, it's fun," Victoria protested, but something in Caspian's gaze made her back down. "Well, maybe next week then. Have fun, lovebirds." When the call ended, Phoenix couldn't hold back a laugh. "Did you just use my pregnancy as an excuse to get away from your mother?" A rarely seen smile curved Caspian's lips. "Guilty, but you should thank me. I saved our weekend." In the evening, after a dinner prepared by Mrs. Chowan, they met in the house's library. The atmosphere was cozy, with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves and a crackling fireplace. "I found something that might interest you," Caspian said, taking a photo album from a shelf. "The memories that make this place special?" Sitting side by side on the leather sofa, they flipped through pages of summers past. Phoenix smiled at the sight of a child Caspian, with the same intense eyes, but a freer smile. "What happened to that boy?" she asked softly. Caspian closed the album, his gaze lost in the flames of the fireplace. He's learned that feelings are too complicated in the business world. And now, Phoenix dared to ask, "Do you still believe that?" The silence that followed was charged with meaning. Caspian turned to her, his eyes reflecting the glow of the fire. His hand found hers on the sofa, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Now," he began, his voice hoarse, "now I'm not sure of anything." The moment was interrupted by a particularly strong kick from one of the twins. Phoenix gasped, instinctively putting his hand to his stomach. Without hesitation, Caspian placed his hand on hers. "They're restless today," she commented, tried to ignore how her heart raced at his touch. "Maybe it's the sea air," he suggested, but didn't remove his hand. "Or maybe they also feel that something is changing." Phoenix met his gaze, realizing that they were closer than they had ever been before. The air between them seemed electrified with unspoken possibilities. "Caspian," she whispered, "what are we doing?" "I don't know," he admitted, his other hand coming up to touch her face. "But for the first time in a long time, I don't want to analyze every move. I don't want to calculate risks and benefits." The waves broke gently against the beach outside, their rhythm as steady as the accelerated beats of their hearts. In the library of the house that held so many Drake memories, Phoenix and Caspian found themselves on the brink of something new and frightening. The possibility that their agreement of convenience was turning into something much more real and profound than either of them had planned. An unexpected storm hit Newport the next morning, confining Phoenix and Caspian to the Victorian mansion. Raindrops drummed against the windows as they shared a late breakfast in the conservatory, a glass-enclosed room that offered a dramatic view of the raging ocean. "Mrs. Chin said these storms are common at this time of year," Phoenix commented, watching the lightning illuminate the gray sky. Her silk robe, another gift from the infinite collection Caspian had insisted on buying her, slipped over her shoulders as she bent down to pick up another piece of toast. Caspian looked up from his laptop where he was reviewing some emails. Since the night before in the library, something had changed between them, a different tension, loaded with unspoken possibilities. "We used to tell stories during storms," he revealed, closing his computer. "Amelia was afraid of thunder, so our grandmother would start storytelling sessions to distract her." "What kind of stories?" "Mostly about the former owner of this house, a captain who built this place for his fiancée. They say he waited 7 years to marry her, facing the disapproval of both families." Phoenix smiled, unconsciously stroking her belly. "And they got a happy ending?" "Actually, yes. They built a life here, raised 5 children." Caspian hesitated, his eyes meeting hers. "My grandmother always said that true love takes courage." A particularly loud clap of thunder startled Phoenix. Caspian instinctively moved his chair closer to her, his arm brushing hers. "Speaking of courage," she began, gathering her strength for the conversation they needed to have, "we need to discuss what happened last night." Phoenix, "No, please, let me talk," she interrupted softly. "This arrangement was supposed to be simple. You needed a cover bride, I needed security for my babies. But now it's not so simple anymore," he added, his voice low and intense. "It's not fair to either of us to keep pretending that this is just business." Phoenix continued, her heart hammering. "Not when you look at me like that. Not when your touch makes my heart race. Not when—" Her words were interrupted by the sound of Caspian's cell phone. It was Alexander Drake. "Dad," Caspian answered, his expression tensing. "Yes, we're in Newport." "What? When?" "I see. We'll be ready." When he hung up, his face had regained some of the professional mask Phoenix had first known. "My parents are on their way," he reported. "Apparently, the storm canceled their flight to Chicago, so they decided to join us." Phoenix felt his stomach sink. "How much time do we have?" 2 hours, tops." Caspian ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she had learned to associate with his frustration. "Phoenix, about our conversation, we need to get ready," she interrupted him, standing up. The mask of the perfect bride needed to go back in place. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Mrs. Chun organized the extra rooms while Phoenix and Caspian tried to put back together the professional facade that had begun to crack over the weekend. When Victoria and Alexander arrived, drenched by the rain but smiling. They found the couple perfectly presentable in the living room. Phoenix wearing a cashmere dress that disguised her growing pregnancy. Caspian in his designer sweater, both playing the part of the couple in love with rehearsed precision. How romantic, Victoria sighed, settling down next to the fireplace. The two of you, alone in this historic house during a storm. Very convenient for finalizing some wedding details, Alexander added with a conspiratorial smile. Phoenix felt Caspian tensing next to her on the sofa. His hand found hers automatically, but the gesture that had once seemed natural now carried the weight of their unfinished conversation. Actually, Victoria continued, pulling a folder out of her Hermes bag, I brought some sample invitations for us to review. As her future mother-in-law discussed imported papers and personalized typography, Phoenix felt Caspian's gaze on her. There was an intensity there that threatened to break her carefully maintained composure. Excuse me, she murmured, standing up abruptly. The babies. She didn't need to complete the sentence. Morning sickness had become a convenient excuse for necessary moments of escape. In the bathroom of the master suite, Phoenix leaned on the marble sink, taking a deep breath. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman torn between the role she had agreed to play and the real feelings that threatened to overflow. There was a soft knock on the door. Phoenix, Caspian's voice, concerned. Are you all right? I just need a minute, she replied, but her voice shook. The door opened slowly. Caspian entered, closing it behind him. In the confined space of the bathroom, the electricity between them seemed even more palpable. We can't go on like this, he said, his voice hoarse, pretending that nothing is happening when clearly a deafening clap of thunder shook the house, causing the lights to flicker and then go out, plunging them into darkness. In the silence that followed, only their breaths and the sound of the rain were audible. Caspian, Phoenix whispered in the darkness, I'm scared. Of the dark, of us, of what this is becoming, of what happens when we can no longer pretend it's just a deal. His hands found her face in the dark, his fingers gently tracing her features as if he wanted to memorize every detail. Maybe, he murmured, it's time we stop pretending altogether. The darkness that enveloped Phoenix and Caspian in the en-suite bathroom lasted only a few seconds before the mansion's generators kicked in, but that brief moment of vulnerability had changed everything. His hands still framed her face when the lights came back on, his blue-gray eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. Caspian, Phoenix, Victoria's voice echoed down the corridor, breaking the moment. Are you two all right? They separated quickly, like teenagers caught red-handed. Phoenix straightened her dress as Caspian opened the door. We're fine, Mom. Phoenix was just a bit queasy. Victoria appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of maternal concern. Darling, you should rest. This storm is making everyone nervous. Phoenix nodded, grateful for the excuse to leave. In her bedroom, lying on the king-size bed, she could hear the muffled voices of the Drake family downstairs. Her hand rested on her belly, where the twins were moving gently. What are we going to do? She whispered to her babies. How can I protect you when I can't even protect my own heart? A soft knock on the door startled her. It was Mrs. Chun, carrying a tray with ginger tea and lavender cookies. I thought you might need something comforting, the housekeeper said, placing the tray on the side table. Then, to Phoenix's surprise, she sat down on the edge of the bed. You know, I've worked for the Drake family for 30 years. I saw Caspian grow up. I saw how he changed after taking over the company. Phoenix sat up, accepting the steaming cup. What was he like before? Much like he is when he's with you, Mrs. Chin replied with a gentle smile. Open, able to laugh, to care. The weight of his family's expectations turned him into the man you all know today. Cold, calculating. Until now, Phoenix murmured. Until you, Mrs. Chun corrected. Even though it started out as an arrangement, anyone can see that there's something real growing between you. A louder knock on the door interrupted the conversation. It was Alexander Drake. Phoenix, dear, can we talk? Mrs. Chin quietly withdrew as the patriarch of the Drake family entered the room. Alexander had the same elegant posture as his son, but his eyes were softer, carrying a wisdom that only years can bring. Victoria is busy torturing Caspian with wedding details. He smiled, taking a seat in the armchair by the window. I thought we could have a father-daughter chat. Phoenix felt her stomach turn, and it wasn't because of her pregnancy. Mr. Drake, Alexander, please, he interrupted her gently. You know, I've been observing people for a long time. It's a necessary skill in business. And I've been watching my son for the last few weeks. Phoenix gripped the cup tighter, trying to control the trembling in her hands. Caspian has always been exceptional at everything he does, Alexander continued. Except for one thing, allowing himself to feel. When Claire left him, he closed himself off even more. He turned into exactly what he thought he needed to be for the company. Thunder rattled the windows, making Phoenix cringe slightly. But ever since you showed up, Alexander smiled, I see my son coming back. The boy who used to tell stories during storms, who dreamed of more than just profits in acquisitions. Mr. Drake, Alexander, Phoenix began, tears threatening to fall. There's something I need to tell you. No, he interrupted her gently. You don't need to tell me anything. I just want you to know that whatever the truth is between you and my son, what I see is real. And sometimes, darling, that's how the best loves begin. Not the way we plan, but exactly the way we need. The door opened again, revealing Caspian. His eyes immediately met Phoenix's, a silent conversation passing between them. Dad, he said, his voice tense. I was looking for you. Oh, yes, Alexander stood up, smiling. Victoria wants our opinion on the flowers. Apparently, peonies in December are a logistical challenge. When Alexander left, Caspian stood at the door, as if unsure whether to enter or not. Your father is very perceptive, Phoenix commented softly. What did he say? That sometimes love doesn't come as we planned. She met his eyes, gathering her courage. Caspian, we need to talk about what's happening between us. He crossed the room in strides, taking a seat next to her on the bed. I'm afraid, he admitted, his voice low. Afraid that if we admit what's happening, everything will fall apart. The deal, the company, everything I've built. What if we built something new? Phoenix whispered, her hand finding his. Something real? The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of the rain against the windows and the rapid beating of their hearts. Outside, the storm continued, but inside that room, something new was being born, something that no agreement of convenience could have predicted. The storm had passed when the sun rose over Newport, leaving behind a trail of fallen leaves and clean air that carried the promise of change. Phoenix awoke to the first golden rays streaming through the curtains of her suite, her mind still processing the conversation with Caspian the night before. After that moment of shared vulnerability, they'd been interrupted by Victoria, eager to discuss further details of the wedding. The rest of the evening passed in a familiar dance of polite smiles and calculated touches, but something fundamental had changed between them. Good morning, Caspian's voice surprised her when she came down to the kitchen. He was sitting at the center island, an untouched cup of coffee in front of him in dark circles under his eyes that suggested a sleepless night. My parents left early for Boston. Something about an emergency with the wedding planning. Phoenix poured himself some tea, aware of the electric tension that filled the space between them. Caspian, about last night, I got a call from the council this morning, he interrupted her, his voice controlled. They want to bring forward the vote on the succession of the company. Apparently, some members are questioning my ability to lead due to personal circumstances. Our force is affecting your business, Phoenix concluded, taking a seat next to him. It's not a force, Caspian replied, finally turning to face her. Not anymore, and you know it. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Phoenix could feel the twins moving, as if responding to the tension of the moment. We need to make a decision, she said softly. We can't continue in this limbo between truth and lies. It's not fair to anyone, not to your family, not to the company, not to our hearts. Caspian stood up abruptly, walking over to the window overlooking the storm-ravaged garden. Do you have any idea what will happen if we reveal the truth? The entire Drake empire could collapse. The company's reputation. And if we don't? Phoenix interrupted him, his voice trembling slightly. Will we live forever with this lie between us? Will we raise these children in a house built on secrets? He turned, his eyes revealing a vulnerability that few had ever witnessed. "When you walked into my office that day, pregnant and desperate, I thought you were just making a business deal. I didn't realize I was signing over my heart." Phoenix felt tears forming in her eyes. "And now, Caspian crossed the kitchen in long strides, stopping in front of her. "Now I know that no empire is worth the lie on Livy, that no advice or family tradition matters more than how I feel about you." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want to turn this lie into truth," he replied, taking her hands in his. "Not because of the company, not because of my family, but because the idea of not having you and those children in my life is scarier than any corporate crisis." A sob escaped Phoenix's lips. "Caspian, marry me," he pleaded, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Not for the deal, not for the looks, but because somehow, in the meantime between lies and truths, I've fallen hopelessly in love with you." The moment was interrupted by the sound of Caspian's cell phone. Another call from the council. He ignored it, his eyes fixed on hers. "The council can wait," he declared. "For the first time in my life, something is more important than Drake Industries." "What if we lose everything?" Phoenix asked, his hand instinctively protecting his belly. "Then we'll rebuild," he replied with a certainty that warmed her heart. "Together. Our way." Mrs. Chun found them like this, holding hands in the sunny kitchen, the air between them charged with promise and possibility. The housekeeper smiled, recognizing that the truth had finally found its way through the layers of pretense and protocol. "The coffee is cold," she commented softly, taking out the untouched cup. "I'll make it fresher. After all, you have a lot to plan." Phoenix and Caspian exchanged a look, knowing that the next few hours, days and weeks would not be easy. There would be consequences, explanations to give, hearts to heal. But for the first time since their agreement began, they both felt the liberation that only the truth can bring. Outside, the garden was beginning to recover from the storm, just as their hearts were finding a new beginning in the ruins of their elaborate farce. Autumn was slowly dying in Boston when Phoenix and Caspian returned from Newport, the trees along Commonwealth Avenue revealing their last golden hues. In the week that followed the storm and their mutual confession, life at the Drake Mansion had taken on a different rhythm, truer, yet fraught with tension at the inevitable revelation that was approaching. "The council has scheduled an extraordinary meeting for tomorrow," Caspian informed them over breakfast, his fingers intertwined with Phoenix's on the kitchen table. It was no longer a rehearsed gesture, but a genuine need for contact. "We need to decide how we're going to deal with this." Phoenix nodded, feeling the twins move restlessly. In her 16th week of pregnancy, her belly was already visible under her knitted dress, a constant reminder of what was really at stake. "Maybe we should start with your parents," she suggested softly. "After the conversation with your father in Newport." "I agree," Caspian replied, surprising her with his readiness. "In fact, I've already invited them to dinner tonight." Mrs. Chun, who was preparing blueberry pancakes on the stove, turned with a knowing smile. "I'll make the Wellington that Mrs. Drake likes so much." Perhaps good news is best received on a satisfied stomach. The day went by like a countdown. Phoenix tried to work on a few cases in his new department, but his mind kept returning to the night ahead. Caspian immersed himself in preparatory meetings, his expression more tense with each call from the council. At 7 o'clock sharp, the mansion bell announced the arrival of Victoria and Alexander Drake. Phoenix greeted them in the foyer, noticing how Victoria seemed especially excited, carrying more wedding planning folders. "Darling, I found the most divine orchid arrangement for the ceremony," Victoria began as soon as they entered the living room. "And the designer has finally sent over the sketches for your dress." "Mother," Caspian interrupted gently, entering the room, "before we discuss any of the wedding details, Phoenix and I need to talk to you." Something in the seriousness of his tone made Victoria pause, her smile faltering slightly. Alexander, on the other hand, seemed strangely calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Maybe we should sit down," he suggested, guiding Victoria to the sofa. Phoenix felt Caspian's hand find hers, his touch conveying strength and certainty. They sat facing the older Drakes, the silence heavy with anticipation. There's something you need to know about how Phoenix and I really met, Caspian began, his voice firm despite the tension evident in his shoulders. Our engagement began as an agreement of convenience. Victoria gasped, but Alexander only nodded slightly, as if confirming a long-held suspicion. I was desperate, Phoenix continued, tears threatening to fall. Pregnant, about to lose my apartment, Caspian offered a solution that would benefit us both. He would have the fiancé the council demanded. I would have security for my babies. But something changed, Caspian added, his eyes meeting Phoenix's with an intensity that made Victoria put her hand to her heart. What started out as an agreement turned into something real, something neither of us planned or expected. The silence that followed was interrupted only by the soft tinkling of Mrs. Chun pouring tea at the side table. Victoria seemed to struggle to process the information, her hands nervously clenching the planning folder in her lap. So, it was all a lie? She finally asked, her voice trembly. No, Mother, Caspian replied firmly. The beginning was calculated, but what we feel for each other now is truer than any social arrangement you could have planned for me. Alexander snorted, leaning forward in his armchair. And now, what's the plan? I'm going to tell the council the truth tomorrow, Caspian declared. I'll face the consequences of my choices, but I won't give up Phoenix and the twins. You could lose everything, Victoria whispered, tears now running freely down her face. No, Phoenix intervened, his voice soft but firm. They'll have the only thing that really matters, the chance to live an authentic life, to build a family based on true love, not social expectations. Alexander stood up slowly, walking over to the window overlooking the mansion's garden. When he turned around, there was a different gleam in his eyes. You know, Caspian, he began, I've spent years trying to mold you into the image I believed was necessary to lead Drake Industries. But now I see that you've found something much more valuable, the courage to be true to yourself. Victoria wiped away her tears, looking at her son as if seeing him for the first time. Do you really love her? With every part of my being, Caspian replied without hesitation. The dinner that followed was unlike any other they had shared. There was a new lightness in the air, as if the weight of the secrets had finally been lifted. Victoria still asked occasional questions about the wedding, but now her words carried a genuine concern for the couple's happiness, not just for appearances. Later, when the older Drakes had left, Phoenix and Caspian stood on the balcony, watching the lights of Boston twinkle against the night sky. A battle won, Phoenix murmured, stroking his belly. Only the council remains. Caspian pulled her closer, their soft kiss carrying promises of a future that, although uncertain, would genuinely be theirs. The Drake Industries headquarters shone against the gray Boston sky like a column of glass and steel, imposing and intimidating. Phoenix watched from the window of Caspian's top-floor office as board members arrived one by one for the extraordinary meeting. His hand rested protectively on the twins' bellies, as if he could shield them from the storm to come. You don't need to be here, Caspian said softly, adjusting his tie in front of the mirror. I can face this alone. No, Phoenix replied firmly, turning to face him. We started this together, we'll finish it together. The boardroom was an austere environment, dominated by a solid mahogany table and portraits of the former CEOs of Drake Industries. All serious men in impeccable suits, including Alexander Drake. 12 advisors, some in person and others via video conference, waited as Caspian took his place at the head of the table, Phoenix discreetly seated in a corner of the room. Gentlemen, Caspian began, his voice firm despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. I called this meeting because there is something I need to clarify about my personal life and its impact on the company. Richard Morton, the most senior advisor, leaned forward in his chair. Does this have anything to do with your sudden engagement, Mr. Drake? Precisely. Caspian paused, his eyes meeting Phoenix's briefly. My relationship with Phoenix Taylor began as an arrangement of convenience. A murmur of surprise ran through the room. Morton frowned, his gray eyebrows drawing together in disapproval. Go on, he ordered dryly. Caspian then narrated the whole story. The initial meeting, the deal, and how everything changed. His voice, normally controlled in corporate meetings, carried an emotion that Phoenix had never witnessed in a professional setting. I understand that my initial decision was motivated by pressure from this board, he concluded. But what began as a strategy has turned into something real and profound. I'm here not to apologize, but to be transparent about my choices and their consequences. The silence that followed was deafening. Morton exchanged glances with other counselors before speaking. Mr. Drake, your honesty is admirable, but do you understand that this puts the company's credibility at risk? Drake Industries was built on principles of integrity. With all due respect, Mr. Morton, Phoenix said, standing up. All eyes turned to her. Integrity doesn't mean the absence of mistakes, but rather the courage to correct them. Caspian is choosing truth over convenience, transparency over appearances. Ms. Taylor, Morton began, but was interrupted by a new voice. She's right. Alexander Drake had quietly entered the room. For decades, we've shaped this company according to rigid social expectations. Maybe it's time we redefine what corporate integrity means. The debate that followed was intense. Some directors argued that the potential scandal could affect the company's shares. Others suggested that Caspian's honesty could be turned into a positive narrative of corporate transparency. I propose a vote, Morton finally declared, on the continuity of Mr. Drake's leadership. The next few minutes seemed to stretch on forever. Phoenix watched each vote being recorded, his heart hammering against his ribs. Caspian remained upright in his chair, his expression unreadable. By a margin of 7-5, Morton finally announced, the board decides to retain Caspian Drake as CEO of Drake Industries on the condition that an official statement is issued explaining the situation in a transparent manner. Phoenix let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Caspian closed his eyes briefly, relief evident in his posture. However, Morton continued, we demand that the wedding takes place as planned, not for appearances, but to demonstrate commitment to the decisions made. When the room finally emptied, Phoenix and Caspian remained sitting side by side, processing the morning's events. Well, she broke the silence. It looks like we're going to have a wedding after all. With one crucial difference, Caspian replied, taking her hands in his. This time, it will be for true love. Alexander, who had remained discreetly at the back of the room, approached the couple. You've changed more than just the future of the company today, he commented softly. You changed the Drake legacy. From now on, we will be known not only for our success in business, but for our courage in choosing the truth. Outside, the sun was beginning to break through the clouds, casting beams of golden light over the city. Phoenix thought about how his life had changed since that first desperate day in Caspian's office. What had begun as a survival deal had turned into a story of redemption, courage, and true love. Drake Industries' official statement about the unconventional start of its CEO's relationship with Phoenix Taylor generated mixed reactions in the Boston media. While some outlets highlighted the unusual transparency in the corporate world, others speculated about possible ulterior motives. However, for Phoenix and Caspian, the headlines had become secondary to the reality they were building together. The tabloids are calling our story the deal that became love, Phoenix commented, showing Caspian his tablet over breakfast on the mansion's veranda. Autumn had given way to early winter, and snowflakes were beginning to dance in the frosty December air. I prefer to think that love was there all along, Caspian replied, his fingers tracing soft patterns on her hand. We just needed the courage to recognize it. The preparation for the wedding, now genuinely desired by both of them, had taken on a different meaning. Victoria, initially shaken by the revelation, surprised everyone by suggesting changes to the original plans. We need to rethink everything, she declared during a meeting with the event organizer. I don't want a social spectacle. I want a celebration of true love. Phoenix, now in her 5th month of pregnancy, felt the twins more active than ever, especially during the wedding dress fittings. They seemed to approve of the new design, she joked with a seamstress, who had modified the model to accommodate her growing belly with elegance. One afternoon, while organizing some documents in her home office, Phoenix found Claire's old letter. Rereading the words about Caspian's fear of loving completely, she realized how much he had changed. I found something interesting, Caspian commented, entering the study with an old box. Pictures of my grandmother Eleanor with my grandfather. Look at the date of their wedding. Phoenix examined the yellowed album. December 23rd? Just like ours, he smiled. She always said that true love finds its own time and way. I think I finally understand what she meant. The final preparations for the wedding flowed naturally, each decision made together, reflecting not only their individual personalities, but the journey they shared. The Boston Public Library would be decorated in soft shades of blue and silver, evoking the first snow of winter, and only close family and friends would be invited. I found a perfect place for our honeymoon, Caspian revealed over an intimate dinner. A secluded cabin in Aspen, total privacy, views of the mountains, and excellent doctors nearby should we need them. Always planning every detail, Phoenix teased affectionately. Some habits are hard to break, he admitted. Then his face turned serious. But I've learned that the best moments in life are the ones we can't plan. Like falling in love with the woman who was supposed to be just part of a business deal. A week before the wedding, during rehearsal in the library, Phoenix surprised Caspian crying silently in the classical literature section. Hey, she approached worriedly. What happened? I found this. He showed her an old Jane Austen book. It was my grandmother's favorite. She used to say that every great love begins with a misunderstanding, but ends with an undeniable truth. Phoenix wrapped her arms around him, her belly pressing gently against his chest. In what is our undeniable truth? That sometimes we need to lose ourselves completely to find who we really are, he replied, his hands finding the place where the twins moved, and that the truest love can be born out of the most unlikely circumstances. On the eve of the wedding, snow was falling softly over Boston, covering the city in an immaculate white blanket. At the Drake Mansion, the last details were being finalized under the close supervision of Mrs. Chun, who couldn't hide her satisfied smile. I knew from day one, she confided to Phoenix as she tidied up the master bedroom, now definitely shared by the couple. The way he looked at you, even when he thought no one was watching. Some agreements are written in the stars, not on paper. That evening, breaking with tradition, Phoenix and Caspian decided to spend their last hours of their engagement together in the mansion's library, where so many crucial moments in their history had unfolded. Tomorrow we officially start our life together, Phoenix murmured, nestling in Caspian's arms as they watched the snow through the high windows. Actually, he replied softly, our life together began the moment you walked into my office the first day. We just needed time to realize it. The snow continued to fall outside, each flake unique in its journey to the ground, just as each moment that had brought them there had been singular and necessary. What had begun as an agreement of convenience had turned into a love story that defied conventions and expectations, proving that sometimes the best plans are those that the heart makes without consulting reason. The Boston Public Library, with its historic walls and majestic arches, had been transformed into a winter fairy tale setting. Snow fell softly outside while dozens of candles flickered inside, creating a magical atmosphere for Phoenix and Caspian's wedding. Something tells me your grandmother Eleanor would have approved of all this, Mrs. Chen commented as she helped Phoenix with the last details of her dress in the reading room turned bridal suite. The pearl-toned model gracefully hugged her 5-month-old belly, the delicate fabric shimmering under the candlelight. The babies are especially fussy today, Phoenix smiled, feeling the twins' movements. I think they know it's a special day too. Victoria entered the room, her eyes watering at the sight of her future daughter-in-law. Oh, darling, she whispered, reaching up to adjust the vintage lace veil that had belonged to Eleanor Drake. You look absolutely stunning. Are you sure you don't regret canceling the big social event you had planned? Phoenix asked softly. My dear, Victoria held her hands. I've learned that there's a difference between a wedding and a true union. Today we're not just following traditions, we're celebrating real love. The soft sound of a string quartet began to echo through the library, indicating that it was time. Alexander Drake appeared in the doorway, offering his arm to lead Phoenix to the makeshift altar among the centuries-old bookshelves. Ready to officially become a Drake? He asked with a fatherly smile. Ready to simply be myself, next to the man I love, she replied, making Alexander smile even wider. The road to Caspian seemed endless and instantaneous at the same time. Phoenix absorbed every detail. The thrilled smiles of the few chosen guests, the garlands of white flowers entwined in the bookcases, the snow falling silently beyond the historic stained glass windows. But most of all, she absorbed Caspian's expression when he saw her approach. His blue-gray eyes, normally so controlled, overflowed with emotion. She recognized in that look the same man she had met crying among Jane Austen's books, the man who had learned to be vulnerable again. When their hands finally met in front of the celebrant, the world seemed to disappear around them. The vows they exchanged were not elaborate or rehearsed. They were simple, honest, born of a journey that had begun with a business agreement and blossomed into something deeply true. "Phoenix," Caspian began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "you taught me that the greatest strength is not in control, but in the courage to be true. Our beginnings may have been calculated, but every beat of my heart since has been genuine, growing in love for you and our family." "Caspian," Phoenix replied, tears shining in her green eyes, "you showed me that sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as business deals. In you, I found not only security for our children, but a partner who challenges me to be stronger, truer, more myself." When they exchanged rings, not the same ones Victoria had initially chosen, but simple gold bands with their initials intertwined, the twins seemed to celebrate too, moving energetically. Phoenix and Caspian shared a complicit smile, their joined hands resting on the belly that carried their future. The reception that followed was intimate, held in the library's main reading room. Round tables had been set up between the bookshelves, creating small hubs of conversation and celebration. The snow continued to fall outside, isolating them in their own bubble of happiness. "I knew you'd find your way to each other," Mrs. Chen commented as she poured champagne for the guests and cranberry juice for Phoenix. "Some loves are written in the stars, others in the corporate corridors." During their first dance as a couple, to the sound of an acoustic version of "Can't Help Falling in Love," Caspian held Phoenix close, their movements smooth and synchronized. "Do you know what I like most about this library?" he whispered in her ear. "What? Every book on these shelves tells a different story, just like every moment that brought us here. Some are dramatic, some romantic, some even begin with business deals." He smiled, "but they're all part of our story now." Later, when the snow had turned Boston into a postcard landscape, Phoenix and Caspian stood for a moment at the entrance to the library, watching the last guests leave. "Ready for our own winter story in Aspen?" Caspian asked, wrapping his arms around her. "Ready for any story, as long as it's with you," she replied, feeling the babies move in agreement. The driver was waiting to take them to the private airport, where the Drake Industries jet would take them to Colorado. But for a moment, they stood there on the threshold between the past and the future, between the agreement that had been and the love that had become. The snow continued to fall gently, each flake unique in its journey to the ground, just like each moment that had brought them there. What had begun as a desperate solution had turned into a love story that proved that sometimes the best plans are the ones the heart makes when the mind is busy making other arrangements. And so, between old books and new promises, Phoenix and Caspian Drake began the next chapter of their story. No longer an agreement of convenience, but a partnership based on true love, honesty, and the courage to choose happiness over appearances.